Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. My name is Devine. I'm from Concordia University, and today I'm going to discuss some of my work on prevalence-induced concept change in older adults. So without further ado, I want to start with the quote, which is, "The more things change, the more they stay the same." This was first said by Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Karr in 1848, and then again by John Bon Jovi in 2010. Okay, so to actually start, I want to start with the fact that probably all of you know, that we are living in an aging population. By 2068, almost 30% of Canadians will be 65 years or older, and this trend is expected to continue across North America more generally. Fortunately, there's been a good deal of research already exploring the effects of aging on cognition. Research in our lab has focused on how the processes that underlie decision-making change as we get older. And one reason we think that this is particularly important is because we believe by understanding how older adults make decisions, we can get a better sense of how an aging society might make decisions. So in the current series of studies, we focus on one such mechanism that affects decision-making, which is prevalence-induced concept change. So prevalence-induced concept change describes a cognitive mechanism by which someone's definition of a concept shifts as the prevalence of instances of that concept changes. So this phenomenon was first explored by David Levari in 2018. And I mention this because I think that their methodology is a simple but elegant way to demonstrate what I'm sort of talking about today. So in their study, they had people judge whether the color of an ambiguously colored dot was blue or purple. The key part of this experiment was that the ratio of blue to purple dots changed over the course of their study. So what they found was if the frequency of blue dots in the environment decreased, people expanded their concept of blueness such that they judged more dots as being blue at the end of the task compared to the beginning. So this can be seen from these plots here. On the left, you have what happens when the ratio between blue and purple dots stays the same throughout the whole study. And what you see is what you'd expect. Very purple dots aren't very likely to be judged as blue, and very blue dots are very likely to be judged as blue. But what's interesting is if you look on the plot on the right, you see what happens when you decrease the number of blue dots over time relative to purple dots. And what you see is that in the final 200 trials in yellow, people become more likely to judge dots as being blue when the prevalence of blue dots in the environment decreases. And so the idea is that the concept of blueness expands when you decrease the prevalence of instances of blue dots. Now, this is interesting in and of itself, but what is also interesting is that this phenomenon isn't restricted only to color perception. In their study, they were able to show that it extended to higher order decision-making, such as ethical decision-making, when you manipulate the prevalence of ethical and unethical research scenarios. And in both cases, the key idea is the same, that as the prevalence of instances of one concept decreases, people become more likely to expand the boundaries for that concept to include instances that weren't included in the beginning, which again, you see here on the right for the ethical case. Now, these findings are fascinating, but they are also established using a population of young adults, unsurprisingly. However, like we mentioned, older adults and young adults differ in many ways in terms of cognition and decision-making. So it stands to reason then that they might also differ in terms of concept change. So going off of this, the question is, what's at stake? Say that they're more sensitive or less sensitive, what's the big deal? Well, in both cases, there are interesting implications. If they're more sensitive, meaning that they're less consistent and more susceptible to concept change, this might lead to a type of social pessimism where older adults always throw their hands up in the air and say, things were better back in the day, which you can imagine might affect how an aging society makes decisions. If they're less sensitive, however, and more consistent, this might lead to a type of conceptual conservatism, and in some cases may even be beneficial. But I'll come back to all of this a little later. For now, it's suffice to say that these are the types of questions that motivated our first study into exploring this, for which the guiding question was straightforward: are older adults more, less, or equally susceptible to prevalence-induced concept change? So for the first hypothesis, it's mainly based on this idea that older adults have difficulty learning from uncertain outcomes, and this results in perseverative behavior where they tend to repeat responses, which would drive prevalence-induced concept change down. If they're repeating a lot, they're by definition more consistent, and so their concepts change less. However, there's also research to show that older adults are less able to converge on a representation of the current state or the current concept, and they tend to outsource control to the environment. And something like that has also computationally been shown in other work to increase prevalence-induced concept change. So here we have these two competing hypotheses, and our goal in this first study was to try and disentangle them and see which one worked or which one didn't. So to do so, what we did was used the same tasks I mentioned earlier that David Levari used, the dots task and the ethics task. In the dots task, participants are asked to make an untimed decision about whether an ambiguously colored dot is blue or purple. In the ethics task, we asked participants to make a similar decision regarding hypothetical research proposals and whether they should or should not be conducted on hypothetical participants. In both cases, the stimuli range from one extreme to the other, so from very blue to very purple, or from very ethical to very unethical. And the key manipulation here is the prevalence of instances. So in the stable prevalence condition, the prevalence of blue and purple dots in ethical and unethical research scenarios remains stable and equal throughout the duration of the task. But in the decreasing condition, however, the prevalence of blue dots in unethical scenarios decrease as the task progresses. And so it's in this condition that we'd expect participants to be more likely to judge dots as blue and proposals as unethical at the end of the task compared to the beginning. And this is also the condition where we'd expect to find interesting age differences if there are any age differences. And so with all this in mind, what do our results show? Which of our hypotheses are supported? Well, let's start with the dots task. And if we look at our data, we can see that older adults showed reduced concept change compared to young adults. So that is, their judgments were significantly less affected by concept change from the beginning to the end of the task compared to young adults. And you see this in the right column here, which is the decreasing prevalence condition for both young and old. And if you look at their judgments from the first 200 trials and the last 200 trials, you can see that they're much closer for the old adults than they are for the young adults. Now, if we move on to the ethics task, we see something similar. Young adults demonstrate this expected concept change effect, albeit a bit more weakly than in the dots task, but this replicates Levari's findings. But older adults don't show any significant effect of concept change at all in this case. So put simply then, it seems that in both cases, our first hypothesis was supported. Older adults were less sensitive to prevalence-induced concept change relative to younger adults for perceptual and ethical judgments. So the upshot so far then is that older adults' concept space seems to be more rigid than young adults. But now the question is, why is this the case? And to answer this, we looked at another piece of data that we acquired, which was response time differences. And when looking, we found substantial response time differences between young and old adults in both tasks. Specifically, we found that older adults responded much more slowly than young adults, both in the ethics and the dots task. Now, for those of you who study cognitive aging, you're probably shaking your head a little bit, saying, oh, so what? And for those of you who don't, I'll explain why I say this. It's because many findings demonstrate that older adults respond more slowly across a variety of cognitive tasks. So the question for us then was to ask, well, does this slowing down matter in terms of concept change? Is there any reason to think that this should affect prevalence-induced concept change? So to answer this, we modified a recent computational model by Bob Wilson to account for response times, and then we simulated data and saw what would happen. So basically what we did is we held all the parameters of this model constant and then just manipulated artificial response times. And what we found seemed to mirror our empirical results quite well. So by just increasing the artificial response time in the decreasing prevalence condition, we can see that there's a decrease in concept change compared to when the response time is fast, which is what we see between our young and old adults. Now, this is encouraging. It was encouraging enough anyway that we sought out to explore this effect experimentally in an attempt to understand why older adults might be slowing down in the first place and what it might be doing to concept change. So we actually did this in a hypothesis-driven way, of course, and we had two hypotheses, basically that older adult slowing could be caused by general slowing, which is a normal process of healthy aging where people's response times become slowed with age. Or another explanation might be that older adults were engaging in what's called a speed-accuracy trade-off, where it's not that they can't go faster, it's that they're deliberately slowing down in order to be more accurate or maybe more consistent or something like that across the tasks. And so disentangling these competing interpretations was sort of the motivation for our 2 follow-up studies that we did. In study 2, we went after the first interpretation, which is that older adults might just be slower overall, which would increase the space between stimuli because the decisions are untimed, and that might drive down concept change. So what we did was that we collected a new group of young adults because they generally respond very quickly and they're highly affected by concept change. So that makes them a good control group for this idea that it might be happening in old adults. In terms of our method, we used the DOTS task as in study 1, except we manipulated the intertrial interval from 500 to 2000 milliseconds. And by doing so, we were basically just increasing the space between stimuli, but not changing anything else about the task or how participants presumably approached it. And just by doing that, just by putting that manipulation in, we found a significant reduction in concept change compared to young adults in study 1. In fact, young adults in study 2 here showed less concept change than even the old adults in study 1. So what this means is that prevalence-induced concept change, at least as we're measuring it here, is sensitive to the space between stimuli. And this lines up with that general slowing interpretation I gave earlier, that maybe older adults just happen to be slower overall. That increases the space between stimuli, and that's why they're showing this reduced concept change. But even with this finding in hand, we still had an open question from our data that I presented earlier that hasn't been answered, which is why are older adults slowing down in the first place? Now, it could be that they just slow down naturally as a part of aging, but another interpretation is that they slow down deliberately in order to become more accurate. So our question for study 3 was, does motivation matter? If we incentivize people to respond more accurately, do they show a reduction in concept change? And also, do they slow down? So again, we used the DOTS task on a new group of young adults. This had the same timing as the DOTS task in study 1, except now we added a manipulation such that between each block, participants were informed how many mistakes they made and could get more course credits depending on how many mistakes they made. So if they made fewer, they got more course credits, incentivizing them to respond accurately, basically. And by doing so, we again found reduced concept change compared to the young adults of study 1. And interestingly, we also found that young adults slowed down more than young adults in study 1, but that they also slowed down less than old adults in study 1, despite showing even less concept change. So I know that sounded a bit complicated, but the upshot is that above and beyond just slowing, we seem to find that one's motivation or the decision style they approach the task with affects how susceptible they are to concept change. Okay, so I presented a lot of data so far, and I just want to wrap it up and say what it all means. The first takeaway is pretty straightforward, and it's that older adults seem to be less sensitive to prevalence-induced concept change. So when it comes to making decisions in a changing world, they seem to be more conservative. They stick to their conceptual guns, both in terms of low and high level conceptual judgments. Importantly, though, this effect might arise from certain limitations, such as slowing, but it might actually be beneficial in some cases, like ethical judgments, where prevalence-induced concept change might be undesirable. We might want to be consistent in our ethical reasoning. And so it's interesting that it may come from limitations, but might have some beneficial consequences for older adults. Now, in terms of why this is happening, it's a bit harder to answer. We tried to answer this question in study 2 and 3 and found that in both cases, there are interesting implications. First, if older adults' reduced sensitivity to concept change is due solely to their slowed response, as shown in study 2, then it suggests that concept change is sensitive to the speed at which concept change occurs, which is interesting in itself, and we should keep it in mind for when we want to generalize our current lab paradigms. But if it's due to this type of speed accuracy trade-off, this type of motivational explanation, well, this too is really important because it might help us understand how we might curtail some of the more negative effects of concept change, not only for older adults, but more broadly. So overall, I just want to finish by saying our results point to the fact that older adults' concepts seem to be more stable in changing environments. And to return to our quote from the beginning, it is basically just that it seems the more things change our environment and our age, the more our concepts about the world stay the same. So I just want to finish by thanking my co-authors who helped me on this work and to give credit where credit is due. And if you have any questions or find this research interesting, you can email me right here. And now I'll take some questions.